The galaxy, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic bureaucracy, had long ago established a pecking order that would make high school cafeteria dynamics look sophisticated. At the very top sat the Kethmoran Empire, a collection of 7-foot-tall reptilian predators who had somehow convinced themselves that having naturally occurring bone spurs along their spines made them evolutionarily superior to everyone else. Below them, in descending order of perceived importance, came the crystalline Vextai with their insufferable tendency to communicate through color-changing light displays, the aquatic Merthur, who insisted on bringing their mobile water tanks to every diplomatic meeting, and roughly 47 other species, who all shared the common trait of looking down their various appendages at the newest members of the galactic community. And there, at the very bottom of this celestial food chain, sat humanity. Poor, scrappy, surprisingly resilient humanity, who had somehow managed to stumble into interstellar travel using what the Kethmoran dismissively called primitive combustion technology, an adorable mathematical concept. The fact that humans had figured out faster than light travel using nothing but determination, caffeine, and an alarming willingness to strap themselves to barely controlled explosions was either impressive or terrifying, depending on one's perspective. The Kethmoran, naturally, chose to find it amusing. The Kethmoran homeworld of Theskar was a monument to their particular brand of superiority complex. Imagine Mars, but if Mars had been designed by someone with a fetish for both extreme heat and architectural intimidation. The planet's surface was a patchwork of crimson deserts and obsidian cities that rose from the sand like geological middle fingers pointed at the sky. The twin suns beat down mercilessly, creating an environment that would make most species reach for their environmental suits faster than a tourist reaching for their wallet in a gift shop. The Kethmoran, however, had evolved in this hellscape and wore their heat tolerance like a badge of honor. It was here, in the shadow of the capital city's towering spires, that the Empire conducted what they euphemistically called blood trials. These weren't trials in any legal sense that a reasonable species might recognize, but rather elaborate gladiatorial exhibitions, where captured members of lesser species were pitted against the Empire's most prized hunting beast. The Kethmoran justified this barbaric entertainment by claiming it was a sacred tradition that honored their ancestors' hunting prowess. In reality, it was little more than an excuse for the Empire's elite to gather in climate-controlled luxury boxes, sip fermented cactus juice, and watch smaller beings get torn apart for sport. The current spectacle had drawn quite the crowd. Word had spread through the Empire's social networks that they had acquired something particularly rare, a human female. The creature had been captured during a routine diplomatic inspection of a human cargo vessel that had wandered too close to Kethmoran's. The inspection had predictably involved the complete seizure of the ship and its crew, but the Empire's lawyers had assured everyone that this was perfectly legal under subsection 47 of the Galactic Commerce Code. The fact that subsection 47 had been written by the Kethmoran themselves was, according to those same lawyers, entirely coincidental. The human had been brought to the arena in a ceremonial cage that the Kethmoran had originally designed for much larger prey. She looked almost comically small within its confines, a fact that the gathered crowd found endlessly entertaining. The Kethmoran had made various modifications to her appearance during her capture. Several facial lacerations that had already begun to heal, a torn jumpsuit that spoke of a struggle, and what appeared to be dried blood matted in her dark hair. These cosmetic touches were meant to demonstrate that she had already been broken by superior Kethmoran warriors, though anyone paying attention might have noticed that her eyes held none of the defeated despair that usually characterized pre-trial prisoners. The arena itself was a masterpiece of sadistic engineering. Carved directly into the desert floor, it formed a natural amphitheater that could hold nearly 10,000 spectators. The fighting pit at the center was roughly the size of a football field, surrounded by walls of polished obsidian that reflected the twin suns' heat back onto whatever unfortunate soul found themselves at the bottom. The sand had been specially imported from the planet's most remote desert regions, and was said to drain blood so efficiently that previous combat's evidence disappeared within minutes. The Kethmoran took great pride in this detail, as if efficient blood absorption was somehow a mark of cultural sophistication. The Empire's elite filled the premium seating areas, their elaborate ceremonial armor glinting in the harsh sunlight. They spoke in the low, rumbling tones that their species used for casual conversation, the sound carrying across the arena like distant thunder. Their discussion centered primarily on how long they expected the human to survive. The betting pools had opened that morning, with odds heavily favoring a combat duration of less than 5 minutes. The current champion, a creature they called the Blood Sand Reaper, had not lost a single engagement in over 3 years. As the ceremonial drums began their rhythmic beating, signaling the beginning of the trial, the human was roughly extracted from her cage by a pair of armored guards. She stumbled slightly as her feet hit the sand, a detail that sent ripples of laughter through the crowd. The Cathmoran interpreted this as evidence of her species' natural clumsiness, though a more observant spectator might have noticed that she was actually testing the sand's consistency with her toes. The guards shoved her toward the center of the arena, their contempt evident in every gesture. One of them delivered a casual backhand that sent her sprawling into the sand, drawing fresh blood from a previously healing cut on her cheek. The crowd roared its approval, their bloodlust beginning to build toward the crescendo they had paid to witness. But as the human pushed herself back to her feet, sand cascading from her torn clothing, something in her posture suggested that the Cathmoran might have made a slight miscalculation. She didn't cower or plead or display any of the behaviors that the Empire had come to expect from their victim. Instead, she stood quietly in the center of the arena, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. The arena gates began to grind open with mechanical precision, and the crowd's anticipation reached fever pitch. Soon they would witness another demonstration of Cathmoran's superiority, another confirmation of their rightful place at the top of the galactic hierarchy. The human, bloodied but somehow unbroken, simply waited as the shadow of their champion began to emerge from the depths below. What emerged from the arena's depths was the sort of creature that evolution creates when it has too much time, too much caffeine, and a seriously twisted sense of humor. The Blood Sand Reaper stood roughly 12 feet tall at the shoulder, with the basic body plan of a lizard that had been put through a particularly violent growth spurt. Its hide was the color of dried blood mixed with desert sand, providing perfect camouflage in the Cathmoran's preferred hunting grounds. 6 legs ended in claws that could shred durasteel, while its elongated skull housed a mouthful of teeth that made shark dentistry look quaint. 2 rows of spinal ridges ran along its back, each one capable of extending into razor-sharp projectiles that could be launched with frightening accuracy. The creature's most unsettling feature, however, was its intelligence. The Blood Sand Reaper wasn't just a mindless killing machine, it was a calculated predator that had learned to read its prey's fear responses, to anticipate their movements, and to savor the hunt almost as much as the kill. The Cathmoran had spent generations breeding these qualities into their champion, creating what they considered the perfect synthesis of raw power and tactical cunning. It was, in their minds, the ultimate expression of their own superiority made manifest in bestial form. The crowd's excitement reached operatic levels as the Reaper slowly circled the arena's perimeter, its massive head swaying back and forth as it took in the scent of fresh prey. The human stood motionless in the center of the pit, apparently frozen by the sight of her opponent. The Cathmoran in the premium seats began shouting encouragement to their champion, their voices creating a thunderous wall of sound that reverberated off the obsidian wall. The betting pools were already adjusting their odds. The original 5-minute estimate was looking increasingly optimistic. But then something curious happened. Instead of cowering or attempting to flee to the arena's edges, the human began to move, not frantically or desperately, but with the sort of measured, purposeful steps that suggested she was conducting some kind of survey. She walked in a slow arc, her eyes never leaving the Reaper but her attention clearly focused on the arena itself. She was mapping exits, testing the sand's depth, calculating angles and distances with the methodical precision of someone who had done this sort of thing before. The Reaper, meanwhile, had completed its own reconnaissance and was beginning to close the distance. Its approach was textbook predator behavior, slow, deliberate, designed to build terror in its prey before the final rush. The creature's yellow eyes never wavered from the human, and its lips pulled back in what the Cathmoran liked to interpret as a smile. This was the moment when most prey animals would panic, when their survival instincts would override their higher brain functions and reduce them to gibbering terror. The human, however, seemed to have missed that particular memo. Instead of panicking, she began to pick up handfuls of sand, letting it run through her fingers as if testing its consistency. The crowd found this behavior baffling. Was she having some kind of mental break? The Cathmoran had seen many species react strangely to imminent death, but sand fondling was a new one even for their extensive experience. What they didn't realize was that the human was conducting a practical geology lesson. The sand wasn't just sand. It was a carefully cultivated mixture of silica, iron oxide and trace minerals that had been selected for its blood absorption property. More importantly, it was also highly reflective and, when disturbed in the right way, could create temporary clouds that would confuse even the most sophisticated visual tracking system. The human was learning the arena's properties the same way a good soldier learns a battlefield, by understanding every advantage and disadvantage the terrain might offer. The Reaper grew tired of the stalking game and decided to test its prey's reflex. It fired a trio of spinal projectiles in rapid succession, each one aimed to wound rather than kill. The first shot would have taken off the human's left arm at the shoulder, the second would have opened her torso from sternum to spine, and the third would have shattered her right knee. It was a combination attack that had never failed to bring down prey in the past. Except the human wasn't there anymore. She had rolled left, come up in a crouch, and was already moving before the projectiles struck the sand where she had been standing. The crowd's cheers faltered slightly. That had been surprisingly quick for a creature that was supposed to be slow and clumsy. The Reaper's head tilted in what might have been confusion, though the Kethmoran preferred to interpret it as mild interest. The human's next move was even more puzzling. Instead of trying to put distance between herself and the Reaper, she began to advance. Not in a straight line, which would have been suicidal, but in a zigzag pattern that made her difficult to target while gradually closing the gap. She scooped up sand as she moved, filling her torn jumpsuit's pockets with the stuff. The crowd began to murmur among themselves. What exactly was she planning to do with sand against a creature that had evolved in the desert? The Reaper decided to end this curious behavior with a direct charge. Its 6 legs drove it forward with terrifying speed, claws extended and jaws agape. The creature weighed nearly 2 tons and was moving at roughly 30 miles per hour, enough kinetic energy to reduce most organic matter to something resembling chunky salsa. The crowd held its collective breath, anticipating the satisfying crunch that would signal the end of this brief entertainment. Instead, they witnessed something that would be replayed on galactic news networks for weeks to come. The human waited until the last possible moment, then dove to one side while simultaneously throwing a handful of sand directly into the Reaper's eyes. The creature's charge carried it past her position, but now it was temporarily blinded and disoriented. Before it could recover, the human had grabbed one of the spent spinal projectiles from the sand and was using it to rake a shallow but painful cut along the Reaper's flank. The crowd fell silent. In 3 years of combat, nothing had ever drawn first blood from their champion. The Reaper spun around, its vision clearing, and fixed the human with a stare that promised immediate and creative death. The creature's tactical assessment had clearly been upgraded. This was no longer casual prey, but something that required serious attention. The human, meanwhile, had already moved to a different position, and was studying her improvised weapon with the sort of professional interest that most species reserved for new technology. The spinal projectile was roughly the length of her forearm, naturally serrated along one edge, and sharp enough to penetrate the Reaper's supposedly impenetrable hide. She tested its weight and balance with a few experimental swings, then settled into a combat stance that the Kethmoran military would have recognized as textbook small unit tactics. The elite in the luxury boxes began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't how these trials were supposed to proceed. The prey was supposed to run, to hide, to die quickly and provide a brief but satisfying spectacle. They weren't supposed to study the terrain, fashion weapons and draw first blood from creatures that had been bred specifically to be unkillable. The betting pools were in chaos as odds makers struggled to recalculate probabilities that had seemed fixed just minutes before. The Reaper launched itself forward again, this time with none of the casual confidence it had displayed earlier. The creature had learned to respect its opponent, and its attack pattern reflected that new understanding. It feinted left, then right, then came in low with claws extended. The human met its charge head-on, using the spinal projectile to deflect the creature's claws while delivering a second cut, this one deeper than the first. The silence in the arena was now absolute. Even the ceremonial drums had stopped their rhythmic beating. The Kethmoran elite watched in growing horror, as their supposedly invincible champion began to bleed more freely, its movements becoming increasingly desperate as the human continued to exploit every opening with surgical precision. Something fundamental had shifted in the arena's dynamic, and everyone present could feel it. The hunt had begun, but the roles of predator and prey were becoming disturbingly unclear. What followed was the sort of extended combat sequence that would make gladiatorial historians weep with professional envy. The Blood Sand Reaper, now properly motivated by the novel experience of bleeding, abandoned all pretense of casual superiority and began fighting with the desperate fury of a creature that had suddenly realized its mortality was negotiable. The human, meanwhile, settled into what could only be described as a workmanlike rhythm, treating the engagement less like a fight for survival and more like a particularly violent technical demonstration. The Reaper's next assault came in the form of a coordinated barrage. Spinal projectiles fired in rapid succession while the creature simultaneously charged forward, intending to overwhelm its opponent with sheer volume of attacks. It was a tactic that had worked flawlessly against every previous opponent, based on the simple principle that even the most agile prey couldn't dodge attacks coming from multiple angles simultaneously. The strategy had one small flaw. It assumed the prey would try to dodge it all. Instead, the human did something that made the Kethmoran elite question their understanding of basic physics. She ran directly toward the incoming projectiles, using the makeshift spear to deflect the first two while allowing the third to graze her shoulder. A calculated trade that put her inside the Reaper's optimal striking distance just as the creature committed to its charge. The beast's momentum carried it forward into what was essentially a controlled collision, with the human using the creature's own kinetic energy to drive her improvised weapon deep into the soft tissue beneath its jaw. The crowd's collective gasp was audible even over the Reaper's roar of pain and rage. The creature reared back, dislodging the spinal projectile but leaving a wound that sent dark blood streaming down its throat. The human rolled away from the thrashing beast, already scanning the arena floor for additional weapons. She had learned something important about her opponent's anatomy. The Reaper's natural armor was nearly impenetrable from above and behind, but its underside was vulnerable to properly applied leverage. The Kethmoran military observers in the premium seating began to recognize patterns in the human's movement that made them profoundly uncomfortable. She wasn't fighting like prey at all. She was fighting like a soldier. Her positioning was textbook battlefield tactics. Her weapon usage demonstrated formal training, and her tactical patience suggested someone who had learned to wait for the right moment, rather than rushing into disadvantageous engagement. The uncomfortable possibility began to dawn on them that they might not have captured a random civilian after all. The Reaper, meanwhile, was learning its own lessons about underestimating opponents. The creature's natural intelligence was considerable, but it had been trained to fight prey that panicked under pressure. The human's calm analytical approach was outside its experiential framework, and the beast began to display signs of genuine confusion. It circled the arena more cautiously now, its yellow eyes never leaving its opponent while its tactical processing centers struggled to categorize this new type of threat. The human used this hesitation to her advantage, continuing to collect spent projectiles from the sand while maintaining constant motion. She now had 3 of the creature's own spinal spears, each one tested and weighted for optimal use. Her torn jumpsuit had been reconfigured into a crude but functional harness that allowed her to carry the weapons while keeping her hands free for combat. The transformation was remarkable. In less than 10 minutes, she had gone from apparent victim to armed combatant, using nothing but battlefield improvisation and tactical knowledge. The next exchange began when the Reaper attempted a new strategy. Instead of charging directly, it began to circle the arena at high speed, using its superior mobility to attack from unexpected angles. The creature would dart in, strike with claws or teeth, then retreat before the human could counterattack. It was a sound tactical approach that should have worn down any opponent through accumulated damage and exhaustion. The key word being The human, however, had apparently spent her time in the arena's center conducting a masterclass in predictive geometry. She had calculated the creature's probable approach vectors, identified the optimal defensive positions, and was now demonstrating the sort of spatial awareness that made three-dimensional combat look like a choreographed dance. Each time the Reaper committed to an attack, she was already moving to intercept, turning the creature's speed against it by forcing it to either abort its assault or run directly into her waiting weapon. The third successful strike came when the Reaper attempted to use its bulk to simply overwhelm the human's position. The creature reared up on its hind legs, intending to bring its full weight down on its opponent like a living avalanche. It was a devastating attack that had never failed to flatten previous prey. The human's response was to sprint directly toward the creature's exposed underside, sliding beneath its descending mass while simultaneously driving all three spinal projectiles upward into the soft tissue of its belly. The impact when the Reaper came down was tremendous, sending shockwaves through the arena floor and raising clouds of sand that temporarily obscured the combat zone. The crowd held its breath, certain that the human had finally been crushed beneath their champion's superior mass. When the dust settled, however, they saw something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how these trials were supposed to conclude. The Reaper was still alive, but it was no longer the dominant force in the arena. Three spinal projectiles protruded from its abdomen, each one placed with surgical precision to maximize damage while avoiding immediately fatal wounds. The creature was bleeding freely now, its movements becoming increasingly labored as shock began to set in. The human, meanwhile, had emerged from beneath the beast with nothing more than additional sand in her hair and a few new scrapes on her arm. The Kethmoran elite began to display behaviors that their species associated with extreme stress: rapid color changes along their spinal ridges, involuntary clicking sounds from their throat pouches, and the sort of agitated tail twitching that usually preceded either flight or violence. The impossible was happening before their eyes. Their perfect predator was losing to a creature they had dismissed as harmless prey. The Reaper made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation, drawing on reserves of strength that evolution had provided for exactly this sort of emergency. The creature launched itself into a berserker assault that abandoned all tactical considerations in favor of pure, overwhelming aggression. It was a kamikaze attack designed to take both combatants down in a final blaze of mutual destruction. The human met this charge with what could only be described as professional composure. She had been waiting for exactly this moment, the point where her opponent's desperation would override its intelligence and create the opening she needed. As the Reaper committed to its final assault, she demonstrated why humans had managed to survive long enough to reach the stars despite lacking natural armor, claws, or any of the other obvious advantages that evolution had granted to more sensible species. She stepped aside at the last possible moment, allowing the creature's momentum to carry it past her position, while simultaneously grabbing one of the protruding spinal projectiles. Using the beast's own forward motion as leverage, she drove the weapon deeper while simultaneously twisting it to maximize internal damage. The technique was brutal, efficient, and executed with the sort of cold precision that suggested extensive practice in the art of killing large, dangerous things. The Reaper's charge ended not with the thunderous impact it had intended, but with a wet, final sound that echoed through the now silent arena. The creature managed 3 more steps before its legs gave out and it collapsed into the sand, its yellow eyes already beginning to glaze over with the unmistakable look of approaching death. The human stood over her fallen opponent, breathing heavily but otherwise composed. She looked up at the stunned crowd with an expression that suggested she was mildly disappointed by the lack of challenge. The silence in the arena was absolute now, broken only by the distant sound of twin suns beating down on obsidian walls, and the quiet hiss of sand absorbing the last of the Reaper's blood. The Kethmoran elite sat frozen in their luxury boxes, their superior reptilian minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Their champion, their perfect predator, their symbol of evolutionary superiority, lay dead in the sand, killed by a creature they had considered barely sentient. The implications were staggering, and the first cracks in their civilizational confidence were already beginning to show. The human, meanwhile, had begun the practical task of extracting her improvised weapons from the Reaper's corpse. She worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this sort of thing before, apparently unconcerned by the 10,000 pairs of eyes watching her every move. When she finished, she looked up at the crowd again and did something that would be remembered long after the arena had crumbled to dust. She smiled. The human's next action was so audacious that it retroactively redefined the concept of psychological warfare. Instead of basking in her victory or collapsing from exhaustion like any reasonable being would after single-handedly dispatching a creature that weighed 10 times her body mass, she grabbed the blood-sand Reaper's massive corpse by its hind legs and began to drag it across the arena floor toward the elite seating section. The sight of this small, bloodied figure hauling a legendary predator's carcass through the sand like a bizarre trophy was so fundamentally wrong that it broke several Kethmoran observers' ability to process reality. The dragging process took nearly 20 minutes, during which the arena remained locked in absolute silence. The human's progress was slow but relentless, each step accompanied by the wet sound of the Reaper's bulk scraping against sand that had been specifically engineered to absorb blood. She paused occasionally to adjust her grip or catch her breath, but her determination never wavered. The crowd watched in fascination as she methodically hauled their former champion toward them like a cosmic delivery service, with a particularly macabre sense of customer service. When she finally reached the base of the obsidian walls, the human looked up at the assembled Kethmorn elite and spoke for the first time since entering the arena. Her voice was hoarse from exertion and desert heat, but it carried clearly in the acoustically perfect amphitheater. According to your own trial laws, I claim victory and demand immediate release. She paused, wiping sweat and blood from her forehead with the back of her hand. Also, I'm keeping the weapons. Call it a souvenir tax. The legal implications of her statement sent shockwaves through the Kethmorn hierarchy. The blood trials were governed by ancient laws that had been written during a time when victory by lesser species was considered a theoretical impossibility. The legal framework had never been designed to handle a situation where the prey actually won. The Empire's lawyers began frantically consulting their portable legal databases, searching for precedents that simply didn't exist. The crowd's stunned silence was finally broken by the sound of communication devices activating throughout the arena. The Kethmorn elite began broadcasting urgent messages to their networks, their social media platforms, and their government contacts. Within minutes, news of the impossible victory was spreading across the planet's communication grid. Within hours, it would reach the galactic network. Within days, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in known space. The immediate response from the arena's management was predictably bureaucratic. A series of officials in elaborate ceremonial robes descended from the luxury boxes, each one carrying the sort of portable authority that government functionaries use to make problems disappear. They approached the human with the careful steps of people who weren't entirely sure what they were dealing with, but who were absolutely certain they wanted it to go away as quickly as possible. The lead official, whose title roughly translated to Senior Coordinator of Sanctioned Violence, cleared his throat with the sort of pompous authority that bureaucrats across the galaxy had perfected. There appears to have been some sort of irregularity in the trial proceedings. We will need to conduct a full investigation before any official determinations can be made regarding the outcome of today's event. The human's response was to point at the massive corpse beside her and deliver what would become one of the most quoted statements in galactic history. Your champion is dead. I killed it. Your laws say I win. Everything else is just paperwork. She paused, studying the official's increasingly uncomfortable expression. Unless, of course, the mighty Kethmorn Empire doesn't honor its own legal framework. That would be disappointing. The officials huddled together in urgent consultation, their voices creating a low rumble of bureaucratic panic. They were facing a situation that no amount of administrative training had prepared them for. The human had technically won according to their own laws, but acknowledging that victory would require admitting that their most sacred traditions had been defeated by a species they considered barely above livestock. The political ramifications were staggering. While the officials deliberated, the galactic news networks were already scrambling to cover the story. The first reports were confused and contradictory, with headlines like, "Technical malfunction in Kethmorn Arena," and "Possible hoax disrupts blood trial." But as video footage began to circulate, the truth became undeniable. A human had killed the Bloodsand Reaper in single combat, using nothing but improvised weapons and tactical intelligence. The broader galactic community's reaction was swift and dramatic. Species that had accepted their position in the established hierarchy began to question whether that hierarchy was as fixed as they had been led to believe. If a human could defeat the Kethmorn's greatest predator, what did that say about the Empire's claims of evolutionary superiority? More importantly, what did it say about everyone else's assumed inferiority? The political implications rippled outward like shockwaves from a stellar explosion. The crystalline Vextai, who had spent centuries accepting secondary status, began to reconsider their diplomatic position. The aquatic Mirthul started asking pointed questions about trade agreements they had previously accepted without question. Even the more established powers began to view the Kethmorn Empire with something approaching skepticism rather than automatic deference. Back in the arena, the human grew tired of waiting for bureaucratic resolution. She began to walk toward the exit tunnels, leaving the Reaper's corpse behind like a business card written in blood and sand. The officials scrambled to intercept her, but she raised one of her improvised spears in a gesture that suggested she was willing to demonstrate her combat skills on additional opponents if necessary. "Wait," called the senior coordinator, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain authority in an impossible situation. "There are procedures that must be followed, forms that must be completed. You can't simply leave." The human turned back with an expression that mixed amusement with barely controlled violence. "Watch me," she said, and continued walking toward the exit. The officials followed at a respectful distance, their ceremonial robes billowing in the desert wind as they struggled to keep up with someone who had apparently decided that Kethmoran authority was more of a suggestion than a requirement. As she reached the exit tunnel, additional information about the human began to emerge from the Empire's intelligence networks. The woman they had assumed was a random civilian turned out to be a former military specialist who had served in humanity's colonial defense forces. Her record included extensive combat experience, advanced tactical training, and a particular expertise in what human military manuals euphemistically called asymmetric warfare. The Kethmoran had essentially thrown a professional soldier into their arena, and then acted surprised when she had proceeded to demonstrate her professional skills. The human's departure from the arena was as understated as her combat had been efficient. She walked through the exit tunnel without looking back, ignoring the growing crowd of officials, journalists, and curiosity seekers who had begun to gather. Her torn jumpsuit and improvised weapons made her look like a refugee from a particularly violent archaeological expedition, but her bearing suggested someone who had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. The final irony was revealed in the hours after her departure. The human had never intended to participate in the blood trial at all. She had been attempting to negotiate the release of her captured crewmates, when the Kethmoran had decided to use her as entertainment. Her victory had been less about proving human superiority, and more about sending a very clear message regarding the consequences of mistreating her people. The message had been received with crystalline clarity. Within a week, the surviving members of her crew were released without charges. Within a month, the Kethmoran Empire had quietly suspended their blood trials pending a comprehensive review of traditional practices. Within a year, the entire galactic hierarchy had been restructured around the uncomfortable recognition that assumptions about species' capabilities might be somewhat less reliable than previously believed. The arena itself became a monument to the danger of overconfidence. Tourists from across the galaxy came to see the place where the established order had been challenged and found wanting. The Bloodsand Reaper's carcass was preserved and displayed in the Empire's Natural History Museum, with a plaque that read, "In memory of assumptions that proved fatal." And somewhere in the vast expanse of space, a human ship continued its journey with one additional crew member, who had rejoined them after what she described in her official report as a brief diplomatic delay. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the wisdom of underestimating one's opponents, though whether that lesson would be remembered long enough to prevent future mistakes remained to be seen. After all, the universe had always been filled with predators who considered themselves apex creatures, right up until the moment they discovered they were wrong.